So I don't have the faintest idea what love has to do with it. But what I do know is what rhythm has to do with it, and that's what I want to tell you about. We are rhythmic beings. We have annual rhythms, we have monthly rhythms, but our most important rhythms are our 24-hour rhythms, what we in science call the circadian rhythms, circa die. You're probably aware that you have a sleep-wake rhythm. And I'm really fortunate because unless you traveled from some other time zone, you're all in the wake part of your rhythm right now. You may not be later, but right now you are. You're probably aware that you have a hunger rhythm. Let's see. If I had a hand mic, I could put it to my tummy right now, and you could hear my stomach growling to beat the band. In fact, I could set my watch by that 11 a.m. stomach growl. But you may not be aware that we have a host of other rhythms. If you're a mom, you might know that there are times of the day to take your kid's temperature and other times when you don't want to, because we have a beautiful 24-hour rhythm to our temperature. But you're probably not aware that we have rhythms to our muscle strength, to our alertness, to a host of things that we don't necessarily think about. We even have, if we have these terrible thoughts, 24-hour rhythms to thoughts of suicide. Now, where did all this come from? No matter what your belief system is as to how it happened, we live in a 24-hour world. And every creature on our planet evolved to adapt to the rising and the setting of the sun, to that 24-hour world. Now, how does that work? Well, light comes into our eye from the sun. It arrives at the eye and travels along the optic tract to a structure very deep in our brain, a tiny structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. You don't need to remember that. But what you do need to remember is that from that central clock, we have outputs that include our physiology and our behavior. Now, when I was in graduate school, we couldn't see this clock ticking, but now we have time-lapse photography that allows us to see beautiful 24-hour expression of genes in that tiny structure. This happens to be a mouse brain, but our brains at that level are really not very different from the brains of mice. But when I was in graduate school, I also learned that we had one clock and that it controlled everything. But since the tremendous explosion of information that has come with molecular genetics, we now understand that we have clocks all over our bodies. We have clocks in our lungs, we have clocks in our heart, we have clocks in our liver. Here we can see beautiful 24-hour rhythms to the production of enzymes that are critical for glucose production in our liver. We even have clocks in our skin. This is time-lapse photography of fibroblasts, little chunks of skin that have been taken from a human being and put in a petri dish, and we can see every single cell in that fibroblast has a beautiful 24-hour rhythm to it. So what keeps this all organized? Well, again, we come back to the light. What keeps it organized is a hormone that many of you may have heard of, melatonin. Our endogenous melatonin profile synchronizes all of these clocks if we live our lives right. And that means living with the sun. Melatonin rises as the day becomes dark, should reach its peak at the midpoint of our sleep, and then begin to decrease as we move toward wakeness and as light begins to appear on the earth. For millennia, we had so few sources of light that all of this remained perfectly synchronized. If we think about our cave-dwelling ancestors, their only sources of light at night were the moon and maybe a fire in the cave, not enough to affect that gorgeous melatonin rhythm. But this is what nighttime looks like in the 21st century. And every one of those sources of light, if we're close enough to it, is sufficient to suppress that beautiful rise of melatonin, to keep us from sleeping when we should sleep, and to, in a sense, explode that beautiful machine that should be keeping all our rhythms organized. I particularly worry about adolescents as they transition from childhood to adolescence. One of the things we've learned, again, just within the last decade, is that adolescents actually undergo a really important developmental shift in their 24-hour rhythms, particularly in their sleep-wake timing and brain function. Left to his or her own resources, the average adolescent would not go to bed until 1 o'clock at night and wouldn't get up until about 11 o'clock in the morning. But no, that's how their body is programmed. We know that from Mary Carskadden's research. She takes teenagers and puts them in time isolation for 3 weeks in the summer. That's their preferred schedule. That's how their body's functioning. But what we do instead is that we put these young people on a school schedule that requires that their brain be functioning 2 hours before it's awake. And what does that do to their mood? Nothing good. On the weekends, we generally allow them to sleep on their more normal schedule, what their body wants them to do. And what does that do to their mood? Something pretty good. But then we turn it around again on Sunday night and ask that they go to bed probably 2 to 3 hours before their body is really prepared for sleep. And much more important, we get them up 3 or 4 hours before their body and their brain is prepared to be awake. Now, some school districts have actually figured this out. And rather than having those little kids who are wide awake at 6 o'clock in the morning going to school at 9, and the adolescents going to school at 7:30, they've shifted the entire schedule around so that the youngest kids are going to school earliest and the oldest kids are going to school latest. What do you think happens? Well, not surprisingly, school performance improves, standardized testing improves, but one of the big surprises in those school districts that have done this has been a significant reduction in motor vehicle accidents among teen drivers. Why should we be surprised? If a brain that is still asleep is driving to a school in the darkness, it's a recipe for disaster. But we have lots of other recipes for disaster in our society. We have surgeons doing surgery when their brain is still asleep. We have businessmen flying to a place where they're supposed to be able to negotiate half the value of a company when their brain is still asleep. So we need to begin to attend to the rhythms in our life if we're going to function better. Now, we have a lot of data to suggest that sleep-wake regulation, 24-hour rhythm regulation, is important for our cognitive functioning. This is just one example from our colleague David Dinges at the University of Pennsylvania. He took 3 groups of individuals. One group he required to stay in bed for 6 hours. That was his benchmark. He took another group and required that they only spend 4 hours of time in bed, and another group whom he required to spend 8 hours of time in bed. How many of you got 8 hours of sleep last night? Right. So what happened? As you can see, the group that got only 4 hours had steady decline in their cognitive functioning over the course of the study, whereas those who were required to spend 8 hours of time in bed actually had clinically significant improvement in their cognitive abilities that was sustained over many, many days. We have other problems that come from our disconnect between our natural rhythms and the way we're leading our lives. Some beautiful experiments done by our colleague Bruce McEwen, world-renowned researcher on stress at the Rockefeller in New York. What Bruce did was he took mice, and actually mice are very much like us in terms of their genome. The mouse genome is almost entirely concordant with the human genome. And he took these mice who also have a very beautiful 24-hour cycle. They are nocturnal creatures, so they're active in the dark and sleep during the light phase. And flip them around. Had light on in their normal rest time, night on in their normal sleep, light on in their normal sleep time, and darkness in their normal active time. And as he allowed these mice to eat freely, he saw weight gain in both groups, but significantly greater weight gain in his shift-working mice. But more than that, we look at the epidemic of obesity, we look at the epidemic of diabetes in our society, we attribute it to the terrible diets we have and the lack of exercise, but I would argue that it is also attributable to the way we're living our lives, disconnected from our natural rhythms. These are these same shift-working mice. Look what happens to plasma insulin in the shift worker in the group. But even more terrifying is the extent to which circadian rhythms are implicated in virtually every cancer that we know of. If we draw a model of cancer tumor progression, we see that circadian rhythms are related to our endocrine activation, and our endocrine activation is related to our rhythms. These, in turn, are influenced by psychosocial factors like when we get ourselves to bed, when we get ourselves up, when we interact with other people, when we're at rest. And all of these have implications for our immune function. And of course, our immune function is central to whether tumors progress or not. But recent studies suggest that there's a direct relationship between circadian rhythm disruption and tumor progression that doesn't require any of the other aspects of this model. So what are we going to do about this? We are not powerless. We can actually control aspects of this amazing system. At the simplest level, we can harness the same technology that has turned us into 24-hour creatures to turn us back to something like our ancestors. In our lab, we're developing an application that allows individuals to chart when they do the key behaviors in their day, to remind them to do them at the right time, to reward them when they do them at the right time, and to admonish them when they're not doing them at the right time. We can also think about managing the challenges to our rhythms. Your in-laws and your parents are coming for the entire 10 days between Christmas and New Year's. What's that going to do to the routine in your household? Nothing good, probably. But you can set certain parameters so the entire household is not disrupted by their arrival, and that you can maintain what are the healthy rhythms for you. We go on a vacation. We expect to feel wonderful, but sometimes we don't. And it may just not be because we eat too much and we drink too much and don't get enough activity. It may be because of the enormous difference between our daily routines when we're in the workaday world and the non-routines we have on a vacation. A newborn in the household, huge disruptor of rhythms. But many couples make the mistake of letting both partners be disrupted at the same time, rather than thinking about ways in which each can help the other to maintain something like their normal, healthy schedule. Yes, there are biological aids to maintaining better rhythms. The light box that we use to treat seasonal affective disorder can certainly help to set one's rhythms or to reset one's circadian rhythms. There are a vast number of sleep aids on the market, but it's important to know that these really don't solve the problem. They don't reset our rhythms. They may get us to sleep, but that's only one part of this huge engine that we're trying to reset, and they don't really do the job. And then there's melatonin that we can actually put into our bodies. But let me warn you that what you can buy over the counter is little better than talcum. Research grade melatonin is a highly potent substance. Most of you won't have access to it, and if you had access to it, you'd need the 25-page document that tells you the protocol for taking it correctly, and probably 2 PhDs to understand the document. So that's really not a solution. But what I would argue is a solution is to think about how our ancestors live, to think about all this fantastic technology that has evolved in the last few decades as an enormous source of inspiration, energy, but also something that we need to limit in our lives, and to think about turning it off and giving ourselves those 8 hours of rest in darkness that probably all of us need for our cognitive functioning, for our health, and for our emotional well-being. Thank you.